Hey everybody, and welcome back. So today we're going to be going over part 2 of the Gilded Age series. In this video we're going to be talking about the politics and the corruption within the politics during the Gilded Age. Now the Gilded Age politics, called the third party system, featured intense competition between two major parties, with minor parties coming and going, especially on issues of concern to prohibitionists, to labor unions, and to farmers. The Democrats and Republicans, the latter nicknamed the Grand Old Party, GOP, fought over control of offices, which were the rewards for party activists, as well as over major economical issues. Very high voter turnout typically exceeded 80% or even 90% in the northern states, as the parties ran strong campaigns. Turnout in the South was lower. Average presidential turnout 1872 to 1900 was 83% in the North and 62% in the South. Competition was intense and elections were very close. In the southern states, lingering resentment over the Civil War remained and meant that much of the South would vote Democratic. After the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877, competition in the South took place mainly inside the Democratic Party. Nationwide turnout fell sharply after 1900. Despite the high voter turnout, aggressive political campaigning, and frequent nasty elections, there were few real policy differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. Gilded Age politicians are somewhat infamous among historians for having few actual policies and doing very little of importance in office. Gilded Age presidents are frequently called the forgotten presidents because of their mediocre presidencies where they did very little. Political corruption was rampant as business leaders spent significant amounts of money ensuring that government did not regulate the activities of big business. And they more often than not got what they wanted. Such corruption was so commonplace that in 1868, the New York State legislature legalized such bribery. Historian Howard Zinn argues that the U.S. government was acting exactly as Karl Marx described capitalist states, pretending neutrality to maintain order, but serving the interest of the rich. Historian Mark Walgren Summers calls it the era of good stealings, a play on the era of good feelings. Noting how machine politicians used padded expenses, lucrative contracts, outright embezzlements, and illegal bond issues. He concludes corruption gave the age a distinctive flavor. It marred the planning and development of the city's infected lobbyist dealings and disgraced even the cleanest of the reconstructed states. For many reasons, however, its effort on policy was less overwhelming than once imagined. Corruption influenced a few substantive decisions. It rarely determined one. Numerous swindlers were active, especially before the Panic of 1873 exposed the falsifications and caused a wave of bankruptcies. Former President Grant was the most famous victim of scoundrels and conmen, of whom he most trusted. Grant was cheated out of all of his money, although some genuine friends bought Grant's personal assets and allowed him to keep their use. Interpreting the phenomena, historian Alan Nivens deplored the moral collapse in government and business 1865 to 1873. He argued that at war's end, society showed confusion and unsettlement, as well as a hurried, aggressive growth on the other. They united to give birth to an alarming public and private corruption. Obviously, much of the shock improbability was due to the heavy wartime expenditures. Speculators and jobbers waxed fat on the government money. The collection of Federal Reserves offered large opportunities for graft. Under the stimulus of greenback inflation, businesses ran into excesses and lost sight of elementary canons of prudence. Meanwhile, it became clear that the thievery had found a better opportunity to grow because the conscience of the nation arose against slavery. Had neglected what seemed minor evils, the thousands who had rushed into the speculations, which they had no moral right to risk, the pushing, hardened men brought to the front of the turmoil, observed a coarser, lower standard of conduct. Much of the trouble lay in the immense growth of national wealth, unaccompanied by any corresponding growth in civic responsibility. Major scandals reached into Congress with the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1872 and disgraced the White House during the Grant administration from 1869 to 1877. This corruption divided the Republican Party into two different factors: the stalwarts, led by Roscoe Conkling, and the half-breeds, led by James Blaine. There was a sense of government-enabled political machines intervened in the economy, and that the resulting favoritism, bribery, inefficiency, waste, and corruption were having negative consequences. Accordingly, there were widespread calls for reform, such as civil service reform, led by the Bourbon Democrats and Republican mugwumps. In 1884, their support elected Democratic Grover Cleveland to the White House, and in doing so gave the Democrats their first national victory since 1856. The Bourbon Democrats supported a free market policy with low tariffs, low taxes, less spending, in general, a laissez-faire, hands-off government. They argued that tariffs made most goods more expensive for the consumers and subsidized the trusts, monopolies, that also denounced imperialism and overseas expansion. By contrast, Republicans insisted that national prosperity depended on industries that paid high wages and warned that lowering the tariffs would bring disaster because goods from low-wage European factories would flood American markets. Presidential elections between the two major parties were so closely contested that a slight nudge could tip the election in the advantage of either party, and Congress was marked by political stalemate. With support from union veterans, businessmen, professionals, craftsmen, and larger farmers, the Republicans consistently carried the North in presidential elections. The Democrats, often led by Irish Catholics, had a base among Catholics, poorer farmers, and traditional party members. The nation elected a string of relatively weak presidents, collectively referring to them as the forgotten presidents. Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, and Harrison, with the exception of Cleveland, who survived the White House during this period. What little political vitality existed in the Gilded Age America was to be found in local settings or in Congress, which overshadowed the White House for most of this period. Overall, Republicans and Democratic political platforms remained remarkably consistent during the years before 1900. Both favored business interests. Republican calls for high tariffs, while Democrats wanted hard money and free trade. Regulation was rarely an issue. Muckrakers is a term used to describe reporters who exposed corruption among politicians and the elite. They used investigative journalism and the print revolution to dig through the muck of the Gilded Age and reported scandal and injustice. In 1890, reporter and photographer Jacob Riis brought the horrors of New York slum life to light in his book, How the Other Half Lives, prompting New York politicians to pass legislation to improve tenement conditions. In 1902, McClure magazine journalist Lincoln Steffens took on city corruption when he penned the article Tweed Days in St. Louis. The article, which is widely considered the first muckraking magazine article, exposed how city officials deceitfully made deals and crooked businessmen to maintain power. Another journalist, Ida Tarbell, spent years investigating the underhanded rise of oilman John D. Rockefeller. Her 19-part series, also published in McClure in 1902, led to the breakup of Rockefeller's monopoly, the Standard Oil Company. In 1906, activist, journalist, and novelist Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle to expose horrendous working conditions in the meatpacking industry. The book and ensuing public outcry led to the passing of the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act. Many other pivotal events happened during the Gilded Age, which changed America's course and culture, as muckrakers exposed corruption, robber barons and politicians, labor unions and reformist politicians enacting laws to limit their power. The Western frontier saw violent conflict between the white settlers and the United States Army against Native Americans. The Native Americans were eventually forced off of their land and onto reservation, with often disastrous results. In 1890, the Western frontier was declared closed. So we're going to be continuing this series in part 3, which will be coming out in just a few days. And if you can please subscribe to the channel, give a like to this video to help us out with the algorithm. And if you leave comments, I will personally reply to your comments on here. And I do want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch these videos on our history here in America. Have a good day, everybody.